The book of Ruth, chapter 1. I'm going to read a bit of a passage here, beginning with verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, or daughters-in-law, "Go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Ophrah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Chris, will you pray over the message this morning, Chris Hawk?
Lord, we're grateful to be in your presence this morning. And I just pray that you would make us very mindful of your Holy Spirit here with us. I pray, Lord, that your hand would rest on Pastor Stephen. Just pray that the words that he speaks would be your words. We just pray, God, for your presence and your guidance and your wisdom, and that you would grow us in the way that we need to grow. We pray these things in your strong, holy, and mighty name, Jesus.
Amen. The title of the message this morning is Unimportant People and the Will of God. Unimportant people and the will of God. So an immediate disclaimer, of course, is there are no unimportant people, but it's a matter of perspective. The book of Ruth is a true story about real people and real people's lives. But it also begins a bit like the old storybooks and fairy tales that we read when we were children. Like Cinderella, for example. These stories usually begin, at least some of them, like Cinderella, begin with a searing tragedy. And as the story begins, the fate of the main characters in the story lies in doubt. Generally, in the old stories, you have at least one character, though, like Mrs. Potts from the Walt Disney version of Beauty and the Beast, And there'll be a hint at how the end of the story is going to go. She hinted, cheer up, child. It'll turn out right in the end. You'll see. And sure enough, it always did in the stories. But that's not how it feels for us many times. Like everything's going to turn out right in the end. When we face great challenges, and that's not how it felt for Ruth and Naomi, I'm sure. In the story, you can kind of picture yourself along with them. After both had experienced loss of their husbands, and Naomi had lost not only her husband, but both of her sons, and they were headed back in the story from Moab, on the eastern side of the Jordan River and south of Israel, back to Israel. And they were headed on this trip. It was about 60 to 75 miles approximately. And it would have taken them about 7 to 10 days, because back in those days they took the good old-fashioned shoe leather express, right? They walked. Can you imagine yourself? Some of us would have had to imagine ourselves a few years younger making that kind of walk, but can you imagine how you would have felt when you got there? And when they arrived, Naomi was, of course, affected by the trip and affected by the last 10 years, affected by the difficulties of her life, so much so that those who knew her, it had only been about 10 years, those who knew her looked at her and said to one another, is that Naomi? Really? She looked different. Life can be hard. I remember, on the lighter side, after I graduated from high school, I'd been out of high school for maybe about 3 or 4 years, and I went away. I'm from Maine. I'm from a long ways away from here. And I went away, and I came back, and I was on a vacation there. And I loved to go for walks, so I got out in the old town and began to walk around in Baileyville. And walking down the street, and I see this truck go by me and kind of stopped and just kind of looked at me, and I vaguely remembered who it was. It was somebody I went to school with. He took a long look. And later on, he ran into my older sister, Brenda, and they had a little conversation, and he said, did I see your brother walking down the street today? Was that him? Was it really him? And she said, yeah, he's here on vacation. It's really good to see him here. And he said, well, I almost didn't recognize him because he looks quite a bit different. And she said, oh, really? She said, yeah, he's a lot bigger around. Looks different. He didn't mean to be mean. It's one of those things. Well, in the eyes of the world, Naomi was just another older person to whom life had not seemed to be very kind, like many, many people that I've met, I'm sure you've met. And to the world looking on, she looked like a different person. You see, life had uncovered Naomi's powerlessness, her insignificance in the eyes of the world, her unimportance. It had labeled her as insignificant, and she didn't seem very important. She didn't even seem very important to herself, certainly not to anybody else. This is where God hand at work comes into play. God providently works in the lives of people, especially people that the world thinks is unimportant. Plan in the lives of his people. He was certainly doing that in Naomi's life, and even though she didn't know, she didn't realize it. The hallmark in the eyes of the world, the hallmark of what the world considers to be an unimportant person, you correct me if I'm wrong, is someone who is driven along by their circumstances, who seems powerless to do anything in the face of their difficulties. If that's you, the world maybe considers you to be insignificant, unimportant. So let me illustrate what I mean here just real briefly. Going back in the story a little bit, we read earlier in the service these verses about how Ruth and her husband and her sons end up down in Moab to begin with. There was a famine. I hope none of us ever have to live through a famine, but there was a famine. There was a lack of food. Usually that was caused by a period maybe of years of bad weather for growing crops. Or it could be caused by war, and it quite often was. And there just wasn't enough food to eat. And so they were driven by that out of their own country. Naomi, her husband, and her sons were powerless before the effects of the famine. And they had no ability to do anything with that. They couldn't provide for their family, and so they were driven out. We might say that their experience pulls back the curtain. The curtain of the illusion of power and control that we often feel that we have. And she was confronted with the reality of human vulnerability and frailty. Now, some people seem to experience this unveiling of our frailty and a lack of power and vulnerability sooner than others and more intensely than others. But at some point, we all are confronted with it. When you were children, were any of you ever afraid of the dark? I was way afraid of it. Yeah. Now, some people have a greater or lesser fear of the dark even now as adults, those of you who are adults. And if some of us were to tell the absolute truth about it, to some extent, we may still have that fear. Anybody going to admit that? I'm not going to admit it. Yeah, could be. I was talking to Janine one day about someone who's afraid of the dark, and she echoed that sentiment. Yeah, they're afraid of the dark. And I said, but really, they're not afraid of the dark. I've never been afraid of the dark, not really. What I'm afraid of is what might be in the dark. It's really about that sense of human frailty and vulnerability that we have. But we human beings, we're really good at hiding it. Nobody really wanted to raise their hand, even most of you did. We hide it. For some time, there have been some institutional dividers. You know what those are? The accordion dividers with the plastic coating, but they're really, inside they're just metal and they're like accordions, really big accordions. And they used to hang from tracks in the fellowship hall. And so they were out behind the garage, and they bugged me, wanted to get rid of them, you know. I don't know why. So finally we came up with a plan to get rid of them, and it was like a 3-step process. And so we took them apart and got the plastic separated, which we, little at a time, got to the landfill. And the metal, we found somebody who scraps metal, and we got them to get all of those on a truck. Off they went. But at the beginning of the project, we started moving the pile. And I'll try not to say this in too shocking a way, but as we started moving the pile and we're kind of gathered around in a little bit of a circle, out ran a rat. And in my exterior person, I've learned, especially with doing counseling, I've learned I can make my feelings go away. You don't know what I think. You don't know what I think, don't know what I feel. So the rat ran, and immediately I went into that mode. And somebody said, I think that was a rat. And I just said, yep, it was a rat. But inside, I was like, man, I wish I could jump up the side of the building to get away. So I'm afraid of rats. We hide it. But Naomi wasn't afforded the luxury of being able to hide her vulnerability, her lack of power in the situation. She'd been driven out of her country. Remember, she'd lost the people she loved. When she arrived back in Israel after the 10 years, she was very likely very, very poor. They walked to get there. They couldn't take much. The picture of frailty, human trouble, lack of power to do anything about it. In the eyes of the world, someone unimportant. Do you have troubles? Anybody got troubles? Every time we meet for church and we have prayer, and every time we think about issues that need prayer, there's about a 6,000-pound elephant in the room. And there is even right now. And the troubles that we face collectively as a people, as a country, as people living in these times and in this place and in the current difficulties that we face. And I'd be the first person to say this morning to actually acknowledge that I have grief about the things that are happening in our country, many of the things. Grief-stricken. Some of them we don't talk about. I lay in my bed at night, and when I think of them, I just cry out to God, God, have mercy on us. I do not know what you think about what is happening or what should happen that would make things better, but I wonder. I do wonder. I wonder if you thought about how the verse that we read earlier in the service applies to our circumstances. Have you sought to apply it to our circumstances? Remember what it said. Verse 28, Romans 8. And we know that for those who love God, is that you? All things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose. All things work together for good. Have you thought about the possibility? I'm going to take you a step further, and don't throw any shoes at me, please. All right? Have you thought about the possibility that things not being or things not turning out the way that you had wanted might be in the service of the good things that God is doing, plans to do. Might be in the service of the plan that he is working out among us, among you, among the whole nation of people, that he's working out through us, that he's working out for us, and most of all, that he's working out for the blessing of people, maybe even that we don't even know. That can be a tough pill to swallow, right? It can be a tough pill to swallow in many different situations, especially in circumstances where we feel that someone has done something wrong, or somebody has done something deliberately to hurt us. Somebody has done something that impacts us or our loved ones negatively or in a damaging way. Generally, situations where there is an antagonist, those are the situations that are difficult for us. One powerful biblical example of this is, of the kind of attitude that we ought to have anyway, is the situation with Joseph. You remember that story? You may know that story. In the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, there are scenes in that story that his brothers hated him. And they plotted, they thought about killing him, even. And finally, they got their heads together and they decided, well, we won't kill him, we'll just sell him into slavery. That's a little bit better, it's nicer. So that's what they did. And they told their father that he'd been torn to pieces by an animal and died. At the end of the story, Joseph had become the prime minister of Egypt. Other than Pharaoh, he was the most important man. And his brothers and his father had come down to Egypt to seek his provision for them. Because this was another time when there was a famine in the land of Israel. And so he was taking care of them, the father, the brothers that had sold him into slavery when the father died. Do you remember what happened then? When the father died, along with grieving for the loss of their father, the brothers that had sold Joseph into slavery swallowed really hard. I don't think I can even do it. Kind of a big swallow. And they thought, well, our dad is gone now, and now Joseph will have the opportunity to get even with us. And they thought even their lives were in danger. This is how Joseph responds to this. He responds with the wisdom that the Holy Spirit would bring to bear through our lives, even now in our own circumstances. Not only as a country, as a people, and all different ways of looking at it, but your own life. I'm not a betting man, but I bet that you either know now or have known some sort of an antagonist. This is what Joseph says to his brothers. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about blessing, and that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Wow. Now we could sit here and parse that whole circumstance for the next several hours and evaluate it. But here's one thing that's very important, that's important to think about. And that's this, that God, we said he brings good out of the bad, right? That God brings good out of the bad for those who love him. That this is true often has more to do with the blessing that flows through us than the blessing that just parks with us. You hear that? That God brings good out of bad often means that it often has more to do with the blessing that flows out of us to someone else than it does just the blessing that parks just with us. God brought good out of the bad with Joseph. And God brought good out of the bad in Naomi's situation. She's not going to know during her lifetime how much. And you may not know during your lifetime how much good God has brought out of your difficulties because He loves you, because He loves those coming after you. If you look in Ruth chapter 4, you'll see there that it says that a gentleman named Boaz comes into the picture. He is a kinsman redeemer. In other words, under Israelite law, the Old Testament law, he is somebody who God brings into the situation, and he is able, through the kinsman redeemer, to redeem the loss of that person in the family tree. Naomi's son and Ruth's husband was lost, but he's not lost because the Redeemer comes into the situation. And then Boaz took Ruth as his wife, and she became his wife, it says, verse 13. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son, verse 17, chapter 4. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. Came through Ruth. And they named him Obed. Now listen very carefully here. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. You talk about blessing coming forth here. God so worked providentially in Naomi's troubles as to bring the great-grandmother, Ruth, and the great-grandfather, Boaz, of King David into the story. He brought them into the family tree. David, the man who God chose to be king, the man who the Bible says is a man after God's own heart, flows out of this story. David, who would be king. As Walter Kaiser writes in his book, Toward an Old Testament Theology, in the midst of human tragedy and failure, relentlessly, God's purpose and promise still went forward. Naomi didn't know that this was God's plan. She didn't see. And she didn't know anything about it in her lifetime. And this may be exactly where you fit into the story. You may not see, and you may not know in this lifetime all the good that is going to ripple down through the generations because of what God did in your life, even through your troubles. You have troubles, I am sure. I have troubles. You probably don't want to hear about them, and I'm not going to tell you. When we think about our troubles, it's tempting to park on the dark side of the troubles, right? To think about how troubling the trouble is. This is often joked about. I'm sure you remember, how many of you ever saw the old show Hee Haw when you were growing up? My mom loved that show, and so I was exposed to massive doses of it, and it's like castor oil in a way. No, just kidding. In the old TV show Hee Haw, uh, sometime during the show, I think at about every episode, the guys would come out and they would sing a not very uplifting song that went something like this: gloom, despair, and agony on me, deep, dark depression, excessive misery. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Gloom, despair, and agony on me. And they just about crawled off the stage at that point. That was funny. They would talk about silly things that had snagged them in life. All joking aside, all of us have felt this way at least a time or two. And even Naomi in the story, she feels this way. She says, call me Mara. You know what Mara means? It means bitter. And she basically tells her neighbors when she arrives back in Israel that God has turned against me. But he hadn't. He hadn't. God has not turned against you. And God has never turned his back on you for a moment, and he won't. You know the 23rd Psalm, don't you? You know that psalm, you hear it every time you go to a funeral. Yea, though I walk through the valley. Why? Not because it's not going to happen, because it was happening. Because God has not abandoned him, and he's not abandoned you. He says, because thou art with me. You're not an unimportant person, really, not at all, because God is with you if you know him. And God is still working out his plan and of blessing in your life, no matter the situation. No matter how you can't even begin to fathom how that could possibly be. So here we are at the end of the message. How might we apply this message this week? First of all, I would say, under no circumstances are we to give up. We can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Because, why? Because he's always with us, never forsakes us. Second, we can seek to focus on the fact that the Lord is at work in our circumstances. I might not know how, and I might not know what, but I know who. I know he's able, and he's at work. Remember that we have hope in Christ, no matter what. I was hoping to sing the old hymn this morning, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. I'm not mighty, but he is. And finally, think about, pray about, and deliberately work to bring blessing into other people's lives. Time is short. John Maxwell talks about repeatedly about adding value to other people's lives. He's not necessarily talking about something they pay for. He's talking about the blessing of bringing something good into somebody else's life. May you have that blessing. May we have that blessing today, all week, and all the time. Will you pray with me?